Good morning, GCA class. We're going to give this a shot. So I'm now recording a slideshow that I made up for you guys, the stuff that I would usually write on the board. Hope you're all well and tolerating our new circumstances of being a little bit isolated. So we'll just see how we do with this. So we're going to talk about the lymphatic system today. The lymphatic system is made up of three main tissue types that we need to know about. The first one is the lymph tissue, and that's groups of lymphocytes and other cells which support them. There are the lymph nodes, which are encapsulated masses of lymph tissue found along the lymph vessels, and the lymph vessels, we'll also talk about those. The lymphatic system altogether is the system of lymph vessels and lymph tissue which serve three basic functions. It looks like I left off the S there, so forgive that. And it's kind of like the circulatory system, but it has some main differences. So the functions of the lymphatic system, there are three main ones that you need to know. The first one is fluid balance. The second one is fat absorption from the gastrointestinal tract. And the third one is immunological defense, very important these days especially. And we'll learn more about each of these as we go forward. So definition-wise, lymph is a watery fluid which is formed from interstitial fluid, and it's found in the lymph vessels. Interstitial fluid is just the fluid that's between the cells that leaked out of the capillaries. So it's in the tissues, and it's a clear fluid, very much like plasma, but the proteins have to stay inside of the capillaries, so it's the fluid that has the smaller elements to it. Carries the nutrients to the cells, carries wastes away from them. Most of that diffuses back into the capillary, but about 10% is collected into the lymph vessels. The lymph vessels themselves they're interesting in their structure, and in your textbook it's in figure 12.2. They have porous, blind beginnings, which means that they have a dead end to them. They're called lymph capillaries, the smallest ones, and they're formed by epithelial cells that overlap each other and leave space in between those epithelial cells where fluids can go in and out. You can see a picture of one here that's magnified, so it's about a centimeter across. Actually, I'm not sure what that scale is, but they're tiny. But you can see the valve in here, that it's one way. So fluid would be allowed to pass through the valve in this direction, but if it tried to backflow that way, it would push that valve shut. Lymph capillaries are found in all the tissues except for the central nervous system, the bone marrow, and any other tissue that does not have a blood supply. Eventually, the lymph travels through these lymph capillaries into larger lymph vessels and goes back to the circulatory system and becomes part of the plasma again. So how does the lymph actually flow through the lymphatic circulation? It's different from the cardiovascular system in that there is no pump, so there's no heart that pumps the lymph through those vessels. The lymph vessels themselves are surrounded by skeletal muscles, and those skeletal muscles squeeze the vessels much like they do with the veins and push the fluid through them. Just like we have valves in the veins, we also have them in the lymphatic circulation, and they prevent backflow. And then some of the larger lymph vessels actually have their own smooth muscles that will also help to squeeze fluid through them. And then finally, when you breathe in and out, you cause a negative pressure to form in your chest cavity, and when you do that, it pulls the lymph towards that chest cavity. So we're going to talk about the main functions of the lymphatic system at this point. The first one we'll talk about is fluid balance. So your body has to keep a good balance of how much fluid is within the tissues and how much is in the cardiovascular system. We'll learn more about that when we get into the renal system coming up, how much water would be eliminated through your kidneys. But for the fluid in the tissues, the lymphatic system handles a lot of that. So you can see here that edema is when you have too much interstitial fluid buildup and that can lead to swelling. So if you've ever had an injury that had swelling in that tissue, that's just an excess of interstitial fluid. So we learned already that plasma leaves the capillaries and 90% goes back into the capillaries, but 10% enters the lymphatic tissue. And you can see that explained in figure 12.3 in your textbook. The second main function of the lymphatic system is to absorb fat from your small intestine. So when you eat foods, the fat that's in there, we're going to learn a lot about this in a couple of weeks, but it gets broken down first from the larger particles of food into smaller particles, and when it gets into your small intestine, there's a lot that goes on with absorption there. And there are specialized lymph vessels that they call lacteals, which run right alongside the blood capillaries, and they're inside of the intestinal villi, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. We call the lymph fluid, which has the fat in it from your digestive tract, we call that chyle. It's a whitish fluid. It has a lot of fat in it, and it goes through the lymph circulation until it hits the subclavian veins, and then it enters the cardiovascular circulation. Here's a drawing of a lacteal. So you have this white vessel here is the lacteal itself, and it's tiny. So this would be a lymph capillary. Around it are the arterial capillaries, so that's the oxygenated blood. And you can see how they switch over to blue here, which is the venous capillary. So this is blood which would be on its return path. And this little thing here is an intestinal villus. So these are the inside of the intestine is on this side of this little purple wall, and then food would pass by this, and the fats would be absorbed into this lacteal here. You can see an actual picture here of several of them, the intestinal villi. They're all right next to each other. Kind of looks like a brush border, they call that. And we'll learn more about that as we get into the gastrointestinal system. But each one of these villi would have the same structure going on in it, and you can kind of see that as it's drawn there in black and white. The third function of the lymphatic system is immunological defense. So the lymph nodes, which we'll learn more about their structure in a moment, but they filter foreign organisms and substances from the lymph fluid. These pathogenic invaders can be bacteria, fungus, parasites, foreign substances, or viruses. And another thing that happens is your spleen actually filters the blood itself. So the lymph nodes filter the lymph, and the spleen filters the blood.